Welcome back. You're watching Business Morning on Channels Television. Of course, our conversation on the program is looking at how companies fare in Nigeria, the ease of doing business, the cost of doing business, the cost of governance for that matter. So many issues have actually been raised since the top 100 companies was announced for 2014 by the Ministry of Trade Investment. Well, on the program today, we're looking at some of the issues and how these 100 companies can become more than we have at present. I'm being joined on the program by the Executive Director, Institute of Communication and Corporate Studies, Dr. Austin Tam-George, and the Director General, Institute of Directors, Mr. Victor Banjo. Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So, mixed feelings usually about the cost of doing business in Nigeria. What do you really think is the significance of this top 100 companies, that were recently celebrated?
Okay, I think that in principle it's always a good thing when the government reaches out to the private sector, especially as partners, to grow the economy and to forge this synergy, between the public sector and the private sector. It's not unique to Nigeria. Everywhere in the advanced societies, you tend to find the public sector working always in tandem with the private sector for a variety of reasons. One, the government tries to work with the private sector to set the tone for business practices in the country. They try to encourage sustainability. They try to also make sure that certain opportunities are created, for employment of the vast majority of the young people we have in different places across the country. There's also the tendency for government to also work with the private sector to make sure that economic policies are implemented across the board, to recalibrate policies in a way that allows for the broadest possible consultation with those who help to drive the engine of growth in the economy. So anytime you find the government working like this private sector, the tendency is that they want to make sure that they're on the same economic path in order to bring progress across the board. So it's always a good thing to have this kind of synergy.
Yeah, but in terms of looking at the synergy now, and you also talked about economic policies, working with those closely with those who are supposed to be like the engine of growth.
Yeah.
We still notice that most of these companies do not source for their materials locally, and that's one of the challenges that a lot of providers of these materials have in days past and even till now. Mr. Banjo, why do you think this keeps happening? Why do these big companies who are indigenously owned, why do they still source, or most of them source their materials abroad instead of locally?
Thank you very much. And first of all, it would be good to actually commend the initiative of the federal government by recognizing these companies. If memory serves me right, it's actually the first time that such a move is actually being done to recognize the fact that government has already create an environment to actually make businesses to really operate well. And so one must actually commend the President Jonathan for actually what he has actually done. And to actually go to the question you've actually asked now, as a country, we actually have a fundamental problem, which is we have actually so good at actually creating what's actually called a business, create an economy that is actually basically sustainable locally. If you look at an average Nigeria, we have a tendency for actually consuming lots of our foreign-made goods, which means that for a very long time we've actually been funding a lot of economies outside of Nigeria. Even historically, when we actually talk about industry, a lot of the things we actually produce are actually basically exported as raw materials, which actually was a comment President Jonathan made. He said, look, we have to learn to do consume what we produce, and also basically consume a lot more of it locally. Because unless we actually do that, what I call a paradigm shift, we'll actually continue to actually struggle. The timing of this award is also very symbolic as well. At the time when we just actually devalued our currency, the whole idea is to actually stimulate local businesses to actually export more. And because when you actually export more, you can actually basically attract more investment to the country, and also basically makes it even attractive for even organizations to come into the country. In terms of our raw materials, to start with, I think the whole concept of actually being an oil-producing country actually basically spoiled us for a very long time. And so we did not pay any attention to developing the non-oil sector. We just had a conference in Abuja last month where we actually made it clear that we're going to talk about how to promote investment in Nigeria. has to do with local investment. In a meeting held last week with the MD of the Bank of Industry in Abuja, I was so proud when we talked about the initiatives being done by the likes of Innocent Motors in order to actually produce more locally. But the focus has to be more is we need to actually do more with our local produce and actually basically process more of them locally, because exporting local raw materials will add value. For many years, we did so well, didn't we? But a lot of it was that local gets shipped out of the country, comes back, has what, finished goods, and we pay more for it.
But then we have companies in the country that actually produce, finished products. We have companies that, chocolate drinks and the rest of it, and some are even trying to make local chocolate.
Yes.
Well, definitely it's not up to international standard, but it's getting there. But the only reason it hasn't gotten there as fast as we would like is because they're not being encouraged. So why is it that we do not encourage local capacity? We always prefer to go outside to source for everything that we need.
If we talk about even encouraging local capacity, one of the major constraints for industry has actually been the fact that if you look at the concept of infrastructure, you talk about basically what's the cost of actually producing these goods locally. So we've been talking about fixing power. When we fix power, it actually makes the cost of production much lower. And if you look at most of the industries you talked about, we need to actually rely on what effective and cost-effective production methods. So I think that's actually what. So Dr. George, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that it's one thing to manufacture. It's another thing to have the capacity to manufacture. We might have the desire to manufacture, but what kind of local capacity? I think that we need to work a lot on the kind of quality of education that we give. We need to be more interested in building local capacity in a way that is usable in the industry. This means that we've got to gravitate away from mere certification and schooling in order to make sure we make our graduates innovation ready, in industry ready. So if you have a mere desire to produce but you do not have the corresponding capacity to produce, the tendency is that you'll be reliant on foreign goods. So this is not something you achieve by wishful thinking alone. I think it goes down the value chain up to the point where you need to emphasize the kind of quality of education you give. My own suggestion will be to make sure that we emphasize a great deal of vocational training. In India, for instance, there is a massive investment in vocational training. In Nigeria, we do not see that kind of investment, I suspect, because we are still embedded in the old thinking of simply getting certification. What we should do is to make sure that we involve all kinds of stakeholders to make sure we invest in capacity building through vocational trainings. Once we do that, we'll have a large pool of people that will go into the industries and then produce as much local manufacturing goods as we should consume.
Dr. Tam-George, let me take you back to what you said at the beginning of this conversation, that it's normal for top companies to be celebrated. This is it's not unusual. We have the Fortune 500, and we also have Forbes doing their own rating as well for top companies and influential people and all the rest. But let's look at the criteria for why these companies were selected. One of the criteria was the fact that their tax returns they were good on tax returns, and in terms of corporate social responsibility, they also ranked very high. But are these just what we should be looking at this particular point, at least for our own type of economy? Is this what we really should be focusing on? Good question.
I think that while recognition of some sort might make the private sector come closer and closer to government, I will agree with you completely that we need to broaden our criteria. I think that what sometimes industry practitioners call best practice is actually a nebulous concept, because best practice supposes that what happens in the US, the standards that we see in the US and Europe elsewhere, are exactly the kind of standards that we'll see in Nigeria. You cannot transplant the kind of institutional strength that we see in the US and North America to what happens here. In Nigeria, for instance, we have a very fragile regulatory framework. And so what you find is that even multinational firms that function abroad tend to lower their standards in terms of how they respond to local circumstances here in Nigeria. So my suggestion would be that we need to broaden our criteria to include not just social responsiveness. We need to make sure we we include environmental sustainability as well. If you look at the list of the companies, for instance, that have been listed as some of the top companies, you ask very important fundamental questions. For instance, there is a company that produces cement that is on that list, and yet there's great concern in this country about the quality of cement that is used for construction. So what I think is that how do you give such a presidential recognition to a company that produces cement, for instance, that people consider universally substandard? That is a matter that is still before the House Committee of Debate. And then what about environmental sustainability? On the list, you find that there are multinational oil firms. And we know that the Niger Delta is one of the most devastated ecosystems. So when you give presidential recognition to multinational firms that still have environmental sustainability issues here in this country, what you seem to be doing is to put the cart before the horse. Because if you give this kind of recognition, and I'm not saying they're not good jobs, they're not doing good jobs, or they're not paying taxes and all that, but I think that we still have a long way to go in terms of developing local criteria, something that is a set of criteria that are meaningful to our society. That will include guaranteeing specific length of employability in these organizations. For instance, I know as a consultant, that we deal with organizations where, people work in these organizations for 10 to 15 years as casual staff. This is manifestly against the law. These people ought to be made staff within a year or so. That's what the labor law says. But you find that a lot of these companies tend to casualize staff. They put them, in these organizations as casual staff. What this means is these staff are not allowed to unionize. They are not allowed, to get pension and gratuity and the rest of them. So these are not part of what constitutes best practice elsewhere. So I completely agree with your question. The point, in fact, is that we need to broaden our criteria and make them home specific. And I think the best assessors for the kind of services that these organizations provide would probably be the public, not government agencies, because government agencies, don't forget, sometimes also function as regulatory bodies. Now, if these regulatory bodies are the ones that are giving this kind of awards, or at least recommending these companies for this kind of presidential recognition, it undermines the kind of institutional checks and balances that we ought to see in the industry. So, for instance, in all my years, working in South Africa, I was a subscriber of MTN. When I went to Nigeria a couple of years ago, the MTN that I saw here in Nigeria was manifestly different from the MTN I saw. So much for best practice. So what I expect is that we need to strengthen our regulatory framework in such a way that what passes for best practice in South Africa ought to exactly be the kind of best practice we ought to see here. And still a chasm between what we see in developed economies and what we are seeing in our country. I think that the award, while good, is premature. We need to make sure we strengthen our institutional mechanisms to make sure we brought them to do even more and better.
Dr. Tam-George, hold on to your thoughts. Mr. Banjo, still talking about best practices. The issue of corporate governance always comes up somehow or the other. Now, in terms of how the companies were rated, could you just, talk about issues of corporate governance with relations to them?
Thank you. One, as well, though, for a country like Nigeria, we need to actually start taking corporate governance at a very high level, because if we look at some of the major corporate failures we've actually seen in this client and even in other countries, it's actually boiled down to a failure of total compliance with good corporate governance principles. And simply what Dr. George has said, many of the companies actually are highlighted in this report, while actually commendable to actually have them, we still need to we expect a lot more from them. And I fully align with this position. And that is actually why we believe that an independently managed rating system would actually be very good. It's also good to mention here that I think such a scheme is actually coming online soon, because the Nigerian Stock Exchange have also announced that they'll be doing the corporate governance rating system, yes, which I believe that once that actually comes online, would actually be what I call very acceptable and also basically tested means of actually confirming the compliance of this organization, because it really hinges on corporate governance. And those companies have to be assessed on, one, basically how well they actually basically are able to basically assure all stakeholders in terms of actually the compliance with all the key issues, similar to the employment practices. And because you can have what is called a license to operate in a country given by government. But there's something we call a social license, which actually means for an oil company, you have your oil mining license. When you go to the local environment, do you also subscribe to the fact that local communities also basically have the right to actually determine how you operate? Because if you create the environment, they have to live with the consequences. So that is part of what the Nigerian Stock Exchange rating system would also be highlighting as well. So it is not only about your financials. We're also looking at basically the practices that will affect society environmentally. So are you leaving behind an environment that is sustainable? And we've been to other countries, in Colombia, Venezuela, where when Shell actually basically lay oil, lay the oil pipelines, they actually put good greenery. And you wouldn't even know that pipelines are actually even buried in those locations. That's part of what the corporate governance rating system from the stock exchange will be looking at. Yes, let us this effort. Well, it's basically what we call early stages. We actually need to basically revise it, to make sure that we have what is called a homegrown homegrown system that actually captures exactly the true reality of where we are as a country, and then develop what we call clear benchmarks for actually how the country needs to be.
Well, Mr. Banjo, and quickly take a break on the program. When we come back, we'll talk more about this homegrown initiatives and schemes that we should be looking at, encouraging at this particular point in time, so that we have more than those 100 companies being recognized next year. Well, you're watching Business Morning on Channels Television, and we're looking at issues with regards how companies should be rewarded in the country, especially in it's the top 100 companies that were recently rewarded as best companies in the country in 2014 by the federal government. We'll continue looking at these issues when we return in just a moment. Please join us again.